Príjemný podvečer, milé dámy a páni, vážení hostia. Ja som veľmi rada, že mám tu česť vás srdečne privítať tu v Starej Tržnici a že môžeme dnes večer spoločne oslavovať 30. výročie od založenia Slovenskej komory architektov. Tak teda ešte raz ďakujeme veľmi pekne, že ste prijali pozvanie. Želám vám pekný večer. Vitajte! A tento potlesk som chcela využiť aj na to, aby ste si dali tie staničky na tlmočenie, ktoré máte pripravené, pretože dnešný večer sa bude niesť výlučne v anglickom jazyku, viac menej teda. Čiže nech sa páči, môžete používať tie staničky, ktoré sú vám k dispozícii spolu so simultánnym prekladom. A teraz prechádzame plynulo do angličtiny. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is a very warm welcome to you here in Bratislava. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for joining us in celebrating the 30 years of founding Slovak Chamber of Architects. So thank you once again. Great to have you here. Tonight we shall speak mainly English on this stage, but in case there would be some Slovak, you can use your headphones with the simultaneous translation. And tonight, on this very stage, we shall celebrate the past, I mean the 30 years of Slovak Chamber of Architects, but also we're going to look forward to the future. We're going to look forward to the future of cities with one and only special guest of this evening, with Mr. Jan Gehl, coming to you from Copenhagen, from Denmark. I know you would like to clap your hands, but he's going to come up to the stage in about 3.5 minutes. After his presentation, there is a special Q&A section for you that you can participate by logging to Slido and using the hashtag FutureCity. That's the hashtag that you can use, FutureCity. FutureCity, good. So that's the hashtag you can use, and then you can ask Jan anything that you'd like. We're going to use it in a Slido. You're going to use it, your questions, that's going to be the part of the interactive corner. And after the Q&A, we have a special panel discussion with Jan, also with a Slovak British architect, Mr. Igor Marko, who is here. Good evening. And also with an architect, and also the mayor of Bratislava, Mr. Matúš Valo. On his way. So thank you so much for being here. But before we're going to start all that, I would like to welcome and invite to the stage our host, our dear host, the president of the Slovak Chamber of Architects. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Iľja Skoček. Dobrý večer. Cítiš sa ako na Oscaroch trošku? Na Grammy? Good evening to you.
Ďakujem. Aj to ako na Oscaroch, áno. Dobrý večer, ďakujem, že ste prijali pozvanie sem do Starej Tržnice. Tento večer je pre nás veľmi výnimočný, ako už bolo povedané. Dnešná prednáška a následná panelová diskusia sú úvodom do série podujatí, ktorými oslavujeme dnešné výročie. Slovenskej komory architektov. Komora vznikla v roku 1992 ako stavovská organizácia architektov a tento rok, niekedy v júni a zároveň aj v októbri, záleží kto ako chce, oslavuje svojich 30 rokov. Okrem jej takej tej bežnej agendy a z takých stavovských povinností voči svojim zhruba 2000 členom má za úlohu zveľaďovať stavebnú kultúru na Slovensku, chrániť naše architektonické dedičstvo a snažiť sa formovať to dedičstvo, ktoré tu ostane po nás pre naše deti. Do tejto sféry našej činnosti spadá asi tento večer. A keďže ako architekti pracujeme hlavne a žijeme predovšetkým v mestách a mestské prostredie je takým našim kľúčovým rámcom, kde pôsobíme. Rozhodli sme sa tento večer venovať práve mestám a ich verejným priestorom. Tvorba a formovanie týchto verejných priestorov je veľmi komplexná problematika. Nie je to len otázka architektov, krajinných architektov alebo urbanistov, preto som rád, že je tu medzi nami množstvo zástupcov verejnej správy, stretol som pár primátorov, starostov a som rád, že všetci si takto spolu vypočujeme prednášku nášho vzácneho hostia, pána profesora Jana Gehla. Na záver ešte jedna menej slávnostná a menej milá povinnosť. Dovolte mi, aby som pripomenul, že v čase, keď sa my budeme rozprávať o budovaní a výstavbe miest, tak v našej susednej krajine dochádza k bezprecedentnému búraniu a ničeniu miest na pozadí jednej veľkej ľudskej tragédie. My sme sa ako stavovská organizácia architektov snažili nejakým spôsobom na tento stav reagovať a nejakým spôsobom v rámci našich možností pomôcť. Vytvorili sme na stránke komory online platformu, aby sa naši ukrajinskí kolegovia mali možnosť uplatniť aj v slovenských ateliéroch. Zatiaľ sa to podarilo viacerým, je tam stále desiatky voľných pracovných miest. A myslím, že zopár z našich ukrajinských kolegov je aj tu v sále s nami. Týmto sme chceli vyjadriť takú profesnú spolupatričnosť s ich situáciou a v duchu hesla tohto večera verím, že aj v takýchto ťažkých podmienkach má zmysel sa baviť o budúcnosti. Ďakujem pekne, pekný večer.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne. Thank you very much for your kind words and for your Ukrainian colleagues. Здравствуйте. Dobrý večer. Очень приятно. I think it's time. Thank you. I can speak more Russian, but I'll try later. I have to brush it up, dig it up from my elementary school. But now it's time to introduce our special guest. We're very happy that he accepted the invitation, that he came again to Bratislava. This is not his first time. I'm sure you don't need my introductory words, but just in case. Jan Gehl, as you know, is an architect. He's a founding partner of Gehl Architects, a professor emeritus of urban design, the Royal Academy School of Architecture, Copenhagen. His publishings include Life Between Buildings, Public Spaces, Public Life, New City Spaces, New City Life, Cities for People, and most recently, How to Study Public Life. Major city projects include Copenhagen, London, Melbourne, Sydney, Amman, New York, and Moscow, among others. He's an honorary fellow of the Architectural Institutes in Denmark, in England, Scotland, Ireland, USA, and Canada. But most importantly, he's a proud grandfather of 7 beautiful grandchildren, and he's here from Copenhagen, Denmark, in Bratislava. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Jan Gehl.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. We're very happy to have you here. This is not your first time in Bratislava.
No, it's not.
Which part of Bratislava, which building, which monument, which corner or street is close to your heart? Is there any place that made an impression on you?
I saw today the Sky Park that did not impress me. It was not really a park, and there was no feeling of sky about it. You should do better next time.
I really appreciate your honesty, and I appreciate you being here in Bratislava. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation for me to come here back to Bratislava. I've been here a couple of times, and as well as I've been in Czech Republic a number of times, and especially in Brno. And I hear there are some people from Brno here, and I want to say a special welcome to them. But thank you for coming, all of you. The subject of today, cities for the future, then we can ask what kind of cities. And I think that if we talk about future of cities, I can tell you about that on Friday. I'm going to start to lecture on the internet to the colleagues in Ukraine. They have started out now a consultancy to try to get good ideas for the rebuilding of Ukraine. It's very moving to know about what is happening over there. It's mind-breaking, whatever. And of course, we will all love to do whatever we can to assist in this endeavor. And I think it's a very, very nice sign that they have started to think about the next phase after the war. So they are optimistic. But the future here is very different from the future we can talk about in other parts of the world. So when we talk about the future of cities, one aspect would be a place like Ukraine. We could also talk about the future of a city like this one. I'm very worried about this one. We can talk about the future of a city like this one, which is overrun by motor cars. And we can, of course, talk about a completely different subject, that is the future of the cities in the third world. But my take on all this about future is, whatever you do, I think there are some first principles which we can apply to all these situations. And of course, when you invite me, you will expect me to come back to the first principles. That is, make it for the people. Put the people first in your agenda. For a while, I have been very puzzled about this future of cities. And it appears that there's a great confusion in this subject. I was at a conference in India, and they were very proud. This was their poster of the conference. And I went around with this picture and say, is this the future or the past? And they smiled and say, that is the future. And I said, oh, holy Moses. If this is the future, I think it's not such a good future. But then I went to a United Nations conference about the urban agenda, and I saw a copy of the Indian poster, and they said, this is the future. Now we have 6 windmills and 2 hospitals also, but still very prominent freeways and whatever. Great confusion here. Then I went to a conference in Germany about Wohnstadt für Demenz. And I looked at this and said, gee, is that for demenz? I hope I'll never catch that disease, and I hope I'll never end a place like this. So cities for the future is very confusing all over the place. But of course, we have some very, very interesting news, because we know now that when we have automatic cars, all the city planning problems will be solved. Whatever we had of problems will be solved. This is from Ford Motor Company, and they are so nice to write that it is many decades from now, because if you look at this one as a place for the future, you'll be very worried about the future. And luckily it's many decades from now, but look at where people are treated. They are down there in the whatever. So the automatic cars will solve all the problems. If we have any more problems, the rest of the problems will be solved by drones and helicopters. The sky will be full of helicopters and drones, and I think it would be an awful prospect of future to have all these drones and helicopters to solve the rest of the problems. Then you can meet other people who say that in the future we'll have smart cities and no problems will be left. Of course, unfortunately, there's one guy who is not so smart, so he's driving in the middle of everything on a bicycle. But we have all these hype about smart, smart, smart. I think that with all these, the drones and the automatic cars and the smart cities, it's very characteristic that you have to buy some gimmicks which are relatively very expensive. And there are some guys here and there who think, if I can get this on the market, I'll be very rich. And maybe some cities could be helped by this, but they will be in the rich part of the world. If I think about Bangladesh, it will be many, many, many years before all these expensive gimmicks could be anything like anything they could use for their future. I had in my office one of the girls who said, I made a search on Google about the future cities, and we sat down and looked at them, and we realized what an awful future we were waiting for. And we actually was quite sure that we would never like to move there, to grow up there, or to get old in any of these places. It appears that when architects are asked about future cities, they go wild and forget about the first principles. I think that the future, hope it will be different from this one. Then, of course, I can make the reflection that maybe there are ideas and examples which could serve as models for where to start with the future, and where we could start right away without too many investments. And then I will go a little bit back in history and look at the problem that for the past 50 years we have done whatever we can to make the cities unpleasant for people, to chase the people out of our cities. And of course I'm talking about modernism, the two dominating planning paradigms. And if we look at them, I think that from 1960 they really started to have a big impact on our world. And we are now also trying to get over modernism and over motorism. If we think about modernism, I say that by 1960 it really rolled out. But as all of you know, it started in the 20s with Corbusier, and it unfolded in the 30s with the Athens Charter. And then there came war and whatever. And only about the rebuilding, when it really took on, when we started to build, people were moving to the cities all over the world, then modernism was ready, and it started to be unfolded in big quota. Of course, this little sketch is from one of the first books of Corbusier, saying that cities are bad. What is good is freestanding buildings. He called this particular building the vertical garden city because everybody could see some grass from their windows. Later on, they could only see the parking lot. But city was bad. He had one chapter about how bad the street was. Everything bad was associated with street girls and street boys and parliament of the street and barricades and whatever. Street, very bad. Never make streets no more. Also, we know that it was about dividing the functions so that you live there, you work there, you go recreation there, and you can transport yourself over here. The modernists, they were very, very thorough in their argumentation. And one of the things which I think, first you can see here, there are some pictures from the good old days, because before modernism, all cities all over the world looked like this. They were made by people, for people. They were made to human scale. They were made for man, who is a walking animal, and they are made for the kind of senses we have. And they look the same in Japan and China and in Italy and in Sweden, all over the place. They always look like this. Then came modernism with a complete other view of things. And they also defined that now we don't have Homo sapiens anymore. We have a new species. We have modern man. And also they said city should be like a machine for living. And actually the modern man, they didn't talk much about modern woman, but they had modern man. He was supposed to run at maximum speed from his bed to the workplace and go back and recuperate so he could work again next day. City as a machine. That was some of the ideas. Looking back, because I'm an old guy, I have had the privilege of being able to see these various decades unfold and see these various ideas unfold. And I can realize, of course, what a fantastic manipulation with the habitat of man modernism was. Because before modernism, we did everything. All the cities were made up of spaces. And in the spaces, life was going on. The spaces was a connection between the various functions in the city. The spaces were where the kings were crowned and the criminals were beheaded, and where the procession were, but where day life was, where the market was, where you met your fellow citizens and your friends. Everything happened in spaces. And if you think about the older cities, everything you can remember, all the things you can remember from the older cities are the spaces. This is Copenhagen, and actually I could right away tell you 100 streets and squares in Copenhagen, but when you think about buildings, I can only think about 2, 3, all of them important public buildings, the cathedral, the parliament, the king's castle, things like that. All the other buildings were more or less anonymous, facing the spaces of the city. If you go back, you all remember the famous map of Noli of Rome from 1748, and here the city is only shown as a series of spaces where life can go on. All this was changed with modernism, because until then we always made spaces, and we thought about spaces as the important thing. A city is a number of spaces. But then came the modernists, and suddenly they were focused on the objects. Suddenly, instead of spaces, we were thinking about the objects, and everything which was not built upon was leftover space. Leftover space is completely different from space for people, because it's almost impossible to do anything with leftover space except parking lots. And of course, this is from Corbusier's plan for Paris, where he said that to make a better Paris, take Paris away and build 24 high-rise where you can sit and look out over all of Paris and see how nice it has become. If you look at some of the newer cities, you can remember absolutely no spaces, because there are no spaces, but you can remember a great number of funny buildings. It's also interesting that this shift from the traditional way of building cities of spaces to focusing on the objects, that was wonderful for the architects, because they set the architects free. Now you can do everything you like. So the architects, they really have enjoyed this period of total freedom to do whatever. And here you can see they're having a jolly good time. All the buildings are the same. It's only the form, and all these architects are thinking, could I make, maybe I can build higher, or, you know, there are many ways of doing it. And also you started to have architecture as something you could buy on the internet. You could say, can I have 3 towers, please? And then maybe Zaha Hadid could come and put down 3 towers in your city without the context of the city. What happened, I think this was a very, very radical change in city planning, completely departure from anything we have ever done in the history of mankind. And what this meant was a goodbye to concern for people and for the social life which goes on in the spaces between the buildings. Then you had all these places which were leftover places, which were completely impossible for people to use. We know this modernism from all over the place. Here's from Denmark. Another photo here is from DDR. But of course I know that you have lots of examples in other socialistic countries. We also have them in a number of other countries, in Singapore, in Korea, whatever, in China, because this was very easy to build and easy to explain. But was it good for people did they enjoy it? We have so many examples of people indicating that we may have had this for 50 years, but did we love it at all? I doubt. And I think it's some evident weaknesses in this way of dropping the spaces for people and going for the objects and the monuments. So all this started really to unfold in 1960. We are about to get over it now to some extent, but that's another story. The other thing which really started in 1960 was the car invasion, where we started to, after the war, to be able to import the cars, and we got more and more cars all over the world. And we can see that was the beginning of a period where people were treated very badly in the cities. This is Bucharest in Romania, where they have a slight little problem there. But what happened in the cities were that all the cities with this new problem at once set up a traffic department, and they started to have perfect knowledge about traffic. So every city I know have a transport department, and they go and count all the cars every year, and they have perfect statistics about, they have modeling, this is how it will be 5 years and 10 years from now, and they were always able to tell the politicians that you need to have more lanes here and more lanes here. In the same time, there were no city who set up a department for people and pedestrians and public life, and there were no city who had any idea how the city was used by the citizens, and they had no data about this. I'll come back to this because what you count, you care for. And the fact that we counted all the cars and we knew nothing about the life made to a very imbalance in the city planning. We were too much obsessed with making the cars happy all over the world. What was happening here was, again, that we got completely confused about scale of city. In the old days, everything was made in 5 km/h scale, but now suddenly we made everything in 60 km/h scale. So it was a goodbye to human scale, just as modernism was goodbye to human scale, because in the old days it was made for people. In the modernism, it was just too big and we felt floating around. With the cars, in the 5 km/h scale, everything could be small. You can see with small speed, you can see everything. You can see little signs, you can see people, you can hear sound, you can see everything close and intensive, and in the distance you can see the mountains. With the 60 km scale, you need big spaces or you couldn't move in that space, and you need big signs or you couldn't see them. And you don't need details because you can't see them anyway. And this, of course, became the scale of the suburbs and the scale of many modern cities, completely out of scale for people. Then we can ask, what was known about quality for people in 1960 when everything was done through many centuries for people? Then suddenly we had modernism and motorism, and we knew nothing about how what we built influenced the life of people. And by 1960, we knew virtually nothing. But of course, when these big new things came into life, we started to see a counter movement. And the first voice, really strong voice, which was raised against this, was from New York, Jane Jacobs, who was living in Greenwich Village. And like in Paris with Corbusier's scheme, Robert Moses in New York said, I'll save New York. We must tear down all the old crap and build some freeways and some high-rise, so have a wonderful New York. And then he made this plan for across Manhattan freeways, and everything old should go. The worst thing was Greenwich Village must go. and Chinatown, Little Italy, Soho, Tribeca, it must all go. Unfortunately, Jane Jacobs, an architectural journalist, she lived in Greenwich Village, and she rallied the citizens, and they started to fight Robert Moses, and they had a vigorous fight. She actually went to jail at some point, but she won, and the citizen won, and Robert Moses' plans were not coming through there. And then she wrote about her experiences. He wrote this fantastic book, The Bible of Humanistic City Planning, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And what she said in this book was, if we let the modernists and the motorists decide our cities, they will be dead and not great. And that had a very big influence, but Americans, they don't move very fast over there. So her ideas were much more taken up in Europe, actually. I'll come back to that. I'll tell you about a very short story on my own life. And again, the year 1960 appears here, because that was exactly the year when I graduated as an architect. So I was trained in the 50s in School of Architecture in Copenhagen. And what did we do in the 50s in School of Architecture? We moved, we floated over models. We always have to be 5 kilometers up. And then we had these objects, and then we moved them around. Bingo, this is a good city. And this was what our professor, he was famous for saying, a good housing district is something which looks smashing from the freeway. Then you have a better life in the housing area. He actually did that particular one in Sweden, which must look very smashing from the freeway. What it was like living there is not really told in this story. I think that looking back, being educated in the 50s was the worst time of city planning ever. There was a time when we stopped 3 times a day and bent towards Brasilia and thought about that was the greatest thing which was given to mankind. I have been there several times, and I'm sure that it was not the greatest thing. Actually, I was trained like this. I went out of School of Architecture to do all these wonderful things I've heard about in School of Architecture. Gee, now we shall make people happy. Then I married a psychologist. And I was young and had just learned all these things. And she was also young. And we had a lot of young architects and young psychologists. And we architects had a very bad time, because the sociologists and psychologists would all the time say, why are you architects not interested in people? Why is it that you learn nothing about people in School of Architecture? You learn about form and form and form. Don't you think that what you build influences the life of people? No. If it looks good, it will work well. Oh, you don't know anything. Say, you know this much, but all the rest you don't know. That was not very easy for a young architect. They also said, why do you think your professors go out at 4 o'clock in the morning to photograph the monuments to be sure there are no disturbing people in the foreground? Strong medicine. In my case, I was so influenced by this discussion that I had to go back to School of Architecture for 40 more years to hear what they forgot to tell me first time. And then, of course, we found out that they didn't tell me anything in the 50s because nothing was known. Actually, what we was told was that people will adapt. It doesn't matter what you build, as long as they have a roof over their head and running water, they will be happy and they'll adapt. And these psychologists kept saying, that's this much of the truth, but all the rest you'll have to. So I was there and trying to find out anything about how was the built environment influencing the quality of life for people. And I started rather soon to focus on what was outside, because I think that quality of life is, of course, that you have a nice kitchen and a nice living room, but what is outside your building, outside, is maybe just as important for quality as what is inside. The way I studied, actually, my wife and I, we went to Italy to find out what does Italians do in public spaces. Why are all the Italian cities so famous for their spaces? So I sat there and they thought I was a beatnik and was very worried that I said I'm studying life in cities and whatever. I did that for 40 years. And using architecture tools, that is observation. I never was trained as a scientist, and I was not really trained to do questionnaires and all that. But by looking at things, you can learn a lot of things. That was my major method. I show you a few examples. What is this? Yeah. At some point, the School of Architecture in Copenhagen was moved out to to the harbor, to a Navy establishment and put into these buildings. And the dean called in a very famous landscape architect and said, do some landscaping here. And he did some landscaping, and he did some lawns with nice iron or corten steel edges. Beautiful. What is in the foreground? That is a corner. And what happens when students come around the corner, what's in the background? That's where you have coffee. And the moment the students see where they can have coffee, do they go in right angles like this, as the landscape architect would think? No, the students go for the coffee directly. And that is, you don't have to go to university for 5 years to learn that. You can see that right away. And the architect, the landscape architect, could have made a much more interesting land. Actually, he had to come back 3 months later to finish his project. He had not finished it in the first. So this is just, we learned that people are very, very careful with energy, their own energy. If they can do shortcuts, they do shortcuts. That's very elementary, Dr. Watson. Another example was what we call the edge effect. All our senses, we are a walking animal, and we are linear walking animal. All our senses are out here. And if we are to wait for a while in a place, we go out to the edge. Of course, if you went right into the middle and stood there and waited for a quarter of an hour, then the other one would say, what's he doing there? That looks very suspicious. He's still there. He's not moved yet. Maybe we call the police. That's funny. No, if you are to stay for a while, you go out to the edge. That's very elementary, because out in the edge, all your senses are front. You can hear, you can see, you have control of the space. I saw in the beginning, all of you were down there in the edge. Only when you were invited to sit, you came forward. So we always stick to the edge. In St. Peter's Square, everywhere, we stick to the edge. It's very, very common. Then, of course, we started to say, maybe architects are different. Maybe architects doesn't go out to the edge. And then, of course, being very careful researchers, we started to study the behavior of architects. And we did studies of a number of schools of architecture and found, oh my Lord, architects behave like ordinary people. And then one can wonder, who put up these things? And who they expect to sit there? I can give you a written guarantee that nobody would sit there. And if you do this, I can recommend you bring some bronze people to make sure that there is some action going on there. Because it's all against human psychology and our senses and the way we behave. All these things are actually very easy to study, but it was not studied. So we started to put all these together, and after a while I started to put them together in my first book, which was called Life Between Buildings, saying that the life between the buildings are as important as the life inside the buildings. And what you build, the distance you put between your buildings and the details of the building, all this is very important, whether you have life or no life. This book actually celebrated 50 years last year anniversary. And now comes the funny thing. Then I started to look into, it's been published in 30 versions. In the first 40 years, it was published in 15 versions. In the most recent 10 years, it was published in 15 other versions. So it takes time to get the message around the world, but it's very well distributed at this point. The last one is from Saudi Arabia, and the previous one is from Iceland. So it's far out in the corners. Then many years went by, and in 2010, we have in Denmark, a very rich foundation for the built environment. They were established in year 2000, and at once they came over to university, to my studio, and say, we think that these studies of people, human dimension in architecture, that is very interesting. We would like to support it. Do you have enough money? You should never ask a university person if he has enough money, because then they say, wouldn't you like to have some PhD students and some distinct lectures and some study tours? And then they made a great contribution to the studies of people. And then 10 years later, they came back. I had left the university and was in my company. Then they came, could we ask you, Jan, to sit down and write down everything you know in one book, as you can still remember it? Then they gave me some more money, in this old method. And then suddenly we had time, and we made the book Cities for People, which of course is also in Czech language, and actually we are coming out now in Slovenia. That will be 39. And it's all over. And to me, that is not because this is especially a good book, but it is a sign that there is not much written about people and architecture. In all these years, there's been not many studies, but at the same time, there is an enormous hunger for knowledge about this, and that will explain why in 10 years this book is out in almost 40 languages. There is, in Bogota, there was recently a mayor, he's just stepped down, Enrique Peñalosa, and he is famous for saying, it's a paradox that we know so much about good habitat for mountain gorillas and Siberian tigers, and so little about good urban habitat for Homo sapiens. And I think that is correct. We don't know too much, and that will explain why these very simple writings come out to far corners of the world. Then at some point, this is my career in the short version. In some point, I did a lot of studies in university, made a lot of books, and then suddenly mayors came and started to tuck my sleeve and say, you can criticize us, but couldn't you come and tell us what we shall do? And that was the beginning of Gehl Architects and the beginning of consulting to cities, which I shall tell a little bit about, but not much. But what I will tell here is something about what we found in our research in these 40, 50 years. We found, of course, that whatever the modernists suggested was absolutely, if you wanted to kill life in the cities, do the modernistic stuff. Actually, you have to do completely the opposite in all these areas. Don't scatter the people, make integration, make things inviting, make good details, and make good quality, and then you will cater for people and life in the cities. And we found that what we built had an enormous influence on the quality of life, on the individual family or the individual person. We say, first we shape the cities, but then, by God, the cities will shape our lives. We can also say that we shape the buildings, and the buildings will also shape our behavior and quality of life. We also found that city planning was very important, but that the details were also enormously important, that you could make a building which will signalize, go on my friend, we don't want you here, and you can make another building which will be inviting and almost say psychologically, welcome, take your time, sit down here if you like. So the detailing was very, very important. And more about the details. One of the best public spaces in the world, I think, is the Campo in Siena. It's been this main city square for 800 years and worked wonderfully all the time, and are still the biggest attraction in Siena. People come to Siena because of the square. And then you start to think, why is this so important? Why is this so famous? Is it common sense or is it a miracle? Then over the years, we have made a list of things which are important, and this I can't go into now, but I'll just tell it's made up of 3 levels. First, something which is about that you need to protect people against the evils of this world, the traffic. You should feel safe, and you should feel comfortable with the climate, so protect against the climate parts you don't like. And then if you made it very nice, then you can start to make it comfortable. It should be good to walk, to sit, to see, to hear, to unfold, and whatever. And then finally comes the enjoyment. It's so important that it is in human scale, that you can enjoy the part of the climate you like. And then as number 12, down there in the corner, is positive sensual experiences. And that's the box for architecture and aesthetics, whatever. I learned in School of Architecture, if it looks good, it will work well. That is absolutely not true. You have to look through the whole thing, and then you can make things with great sense of understanding for design and architecture, materials, views, plants, water, views to the mountains, all these wonderful things, but all the basics will have to be in order also. So it's only one of 12 things. Then we can go back to the square in Siena. And when you go in there with this list, we don't come out and say, yeah. No, for each of these things, you are amazed how carefully it is done. Wow, And then when you come to the architecture and the design and the material and the aesthetic quality, it's perfect. So when all these things are looked after, and it is looked after with a sense of quality for architecture and design, then you have the most wonderful square in the world. We have made some studies to find out that what happens if you make a square, and that's the top square here. That's from Copenhagen, it's brand new, I'm ashamed of it. But out of 12 quality criteria, they've overlooked 13. And what do people do in such a space? They run out of the space as fast as they can. And here they can run from the metro to the shopping center in 42 seconds. That's what they do. The other square is also at the same time. It's from Norway. And here they've done almost everything right. And then instead of running out of the square, people actually come from all over the city to spend time on that square. And people who come there, they get so tempted to sit down and enjoy and see the other people. And if we look at it in a bigger picture, this quality difference is a factor of 10. With the same number of visitors in these places, they have 10 times more life in the square in Oslo on the same day. So these are some of the things we know now, that it's very important what we do. We have a lot of influence on the quality of life for people. And if we shall sum up, we have a fairly good knowledge now. There are some research, and we bloody well do how to make good cities for people by now. So the question is to be able to do it and to find room to do it and so forth. While all this research was being done, and the modernists were doing their stuff and the motorists were bringing their cars in, we, of course, can realize that the wind is changing, and by 2022, we have a number of new challenges for city planning. And I know that these are very universal, because every mayor I know in the world, they will say, that's my program. I want to make a livable city. I have to make a sustainable city. I have to make my city more healthy. And also, it's important to make a good city to be old in. I'll take a little look at these things. First thing about livability, and that's about the meeting of people. That's about not only the big demonstrations and the big parades, but all the daily things that you need to meet other people, to learn from other people, to see the girls and see other people, see your neighbors. And that has always been a very important factor in life in all kinds of cities, from the smallest to the biggest. And the biggest attraction in cities are other people, simply. And I think that we learned during the COVID lockdown how much we missed the other people and the life of the city and the opportunity to meet, even tiny little meetings where we just passed each other. And we could see when we opened up after restrictions how it was like in the spring when you leave out the cows to the grass, they jump out of the stable to eat the grass. In the same way, we have seen even more life in the cities now after COVID, because it's allowed, we can do it, and we missed it so much. So it is very important to look after the life, because that is a very big attraction. And if you're still in doubt about whether life in a building and in an environment is just look at the architecture's rendering of the wonderful projects they're doing. Whether it's a good project or a bad project, it will be crawling with happy people, completely overloaded with happy people. And if there were no people, you will start at once to say, what's wrong here? Maybe it has a strong smell of fish here, or maybe it's unsafe, or so you have to have a lot of people to convince people this is a nice place, because when there are people, it's a sign that it's a nice place. Some people say it's also a sign that the fire alarm works, so all of them are out there. But there are much more people than they ever live in these houses out. So you can see that life in these settings are very, very important on these drawings, which we all do. So life in the new towns and in the old towns and in the new settlements, that is very important to look after, and we can look after it. The other very important issue which has popped up is, of course, the challenge, the climate challenge. And I found in Germany this wonderful that now we can drive the kids to climate demonstration because I have an electric shared car. Maybe that is a solution to sustainable city. Maybe that's not enough. And I'll not go into detail, but just say that we have become more and more aware that the more we walk, the more we cycle, and the more we use public transportation, that is better for the climate in the big game. So that's another issue which drives us today in our work with the cities of the future. Then we have another challenge. And my daughter is a doctor, and she all the time tells me about the sitting syndrome, that people, they don't move enough, and this is a major reason for dying. And 1/3 of all Americans are fat, very fat, and they have to take the escalator to the fitness center, and still it doesn't help them enough. So the World Health Organization would say, we shall make city planning so that people move naturally. It's not enough to say on Sunday you can go in the park. You shall make it so that you naturally walk and naturally bike as much as possible. That's the best action plan for health worldwide. And also, she tells me that you can have 7 more years of life if you move. And also she tells me that your quality of life in the old days would be much better if you move throughout your life, and that you'll need much fewer hospital tours and doctor tours and pills, and it'll be a lot safer, a lot cheaper for society if we move instead of being moved. So move, friends. That's what they tell us, and this is a very serious recommendation. Then we have other things happening now. That is, we have increasing number of elderly people, and already now it's 2025. In Japan, it's close to 30% of everybody. I saw yesterday in a Danish paper that 1/3 of the life of your total life is at the time when you are retired. So that's a pretty long time. And we shall make it so that it's a wonderful time. And the doctor will say, you shall walk 10,000 steps a day. And that's a long distance, I can tell you. And you have to have nice places to do it. And all this we have to put into work. But of course, it's not only to have good for old people, but good for all generations. In Canada, they have an organization for better cities called 880. They say, make it good for the kids who are 8, and make it good for the guys who are 80, and then you will have a good city for everyone. 880. So it's not only that you can run from your bed to your work and back again. We have many more issues now. And to sum it up, we want livable, sustainable, healthy cities, and cities which are good to be young and old in. And if we look carefully after people in city planning, we will efficiently address all these issues. Then we can start to ask, are there actually cities saying, in this city we will do everything to invite people to walk and to bicycle as much as possible in the course of their daily doings? Actually, I think especially after 2000, more and more cities have this on the agenda, to be much more people-friendly, to invite people to use public spaces and public transportation and do whatever they can. Now, I will, for the next 2 hours, I will tell about our work in a number of cities. I could tell wonderful things about Melbourne. It was an absolutely lousy, American-looking city in Australia, full of offices and no life in the city. They decided that they could not afford not to have a vital city in that corner of Australia, because if they hadn't that city, they had nothing. So they decided to revitalize it. They've done a fantastic job. It is by far the best city in the southern hemisphere. It's like Paris, but the weather is better in Melbourne. And if you don't know what to do, move to Melbourne. Then, of course, Sydney. Again, it was waterfront, wonderful city center, absolutely awful. And we had to work for quite a long time with Sydney. But now they have they have really accomplished something about getting the cars out of the city center, getting people walking again, getting light rail up and down the city, whatever. And of course, then after Australia, we worked in London, and we made a fantastic report, and Ken Livingstone hold up the report and say, "We will do this." And then Boris Johnson won the election of mayor, and they did nothing. And that's the only city I worked with which have done almost nothing, London. Boris is still around. But then they heard in New York, they just got a new mayor, Michael Bloomberg, and he wanted to be president of the United States. So he thought, now I do a fantastic job in New York, and then we see. Then came Barack Obama, and that's another story. But in the meantime, actually he sent his crew to Copenhagen to see how you could do it, and then they went back. And as in Sydney and Melbourne, and now in New York, they did a lot for the pedestrians, for the public life, but also they introduced bicycle systems. In New York, the mayor said, "It's silly that we have 1 million commuter cars into Manhattan every day. We have a fantastic metro system. We have flat terrain. We have compact building. It's ideal for bicycling. We have wide streets. We can put in bicycle lane." So all of them also went for bicycle systems. And the most famous maybe is this transformation of Times Square, where everybody said you can never do these European things in Times Square because this is a big apple. We are awake 24 hours a day. Then it was closed to traffic, and next day it was full of people having a jolly good time. Now they made 60 squares like Times Square, and all of them are taken from with asphalt. They're taken from the cars by the city council. They just go and paint them and say this is for people, and they are very successful. This I would tell you about in great lengths. And then, there were 20 slides about our work in Moscow. But it's not the time to talk about Moscow these days. So we skip that. In Bucharest, they've just got my book in Bucharest, so now they'll sort this out shortly. I hear that they're working hard in Bratislava. They're on their way. I've heard that there is good intentions and they seek advice here and there. Excellent. Keep going. And then I'll tell a little bit about my hometown of Copenhagen. And I'll tell about Copenhagen because Copenhagen was one of the first cities who take on this humanistic, this people-oriented city planning. And actually they've been at it for 60 years this year. Copenhagen was lucky. It was not destroyed in the war or the wars, and it was not destroyed by the planners in the 60s or the traffic engineers in the 70s. It was just about left over. It was burned down by the British in 1807, but then it was built up. And a city 200 years old, that's a fine city. Small scale, nice streets. So all the cars came in and it was a really mess. And then the city council decided to take the cars out of Main Street. Everybody protested and said, can never work, and the business will go broke, and we are Danes, we are not Italians, we will never start to walk in Copenhagen, and it's too cold. Then they did it anyway, and next year we were Italians, and we become more and more Italians ever since. It appeared that when we were not Italians, it was because we had no room to be Italians. But then they started this program. It was a success, and then every year they've done more and more for 60 years. Copenhagen looked like this. All the squares were parking lots, and all the squares are now people squares. All the waterfronts were given to traffic and parking. All the waterfronts have now been reclaimed for people. And one important thing about Copenhagen, and then we go back to New York, because if you go to New York and talk to Michael Bloomberg, I heard him talk at the C40 in Copenhagen for all the mayors, and he said, in America we always say, in God we trust, but now bring me the data. He was very, very adamant when we changed New York to have data to tell the people that most of the people are on the sidewalks and most of the area is on the streets and are used by few people. So with these figures, turning them around, you can argue to have much better conditions for people. In Copenhagen was the first city in the world where the life of the city was studied just as carefully as the traffic engineers studied the traffic. That means we were able to tell the mayor and the politicians, this is the data about the people, this is the data about the cars, and then they can make a policy saying which one would we go for. And of course, when you have these data, it became very influential, and actually there started a close collaboration between university and city. And after a while, the city came running down to us in university and say, what shall we do next? How did this work? Whatever. And they started this tradition of every year, or every 5 years at least, to make a thorough study of the life in the city and see how it has developed. Copenhagen has seen a fantastic development. And I'll say this to you guys, because next year we have the UIA, the International Union of Architects, the big conference is going on in Copenhagen, and you have a good pretext to go to Copenhagen and let the taxpayers pay. See you in Copenhagen next year. But there's been a fantastic development of places which are nice for people. Started with one street, now it's a fantastic system. And if we look closer, we can see various periods. The first 20 years from 1960 was about taking out traffic so that people could walk. The next period of 20 years was to make sure that people could sit and enjoy. We could have the culture coming into the public spaces. The third period was about making more for activity, for swimming in the harbor, for bicycling, for skateboarding, for whatever. And now we are into the next one, where it's about climate adaptation. They make big areas which are made like after great downpour of rain, and all the cellars were full of water and was very expensive. Then they have now the climate districts, where they make the whole district so that it works like a sponge. When it comes to rain, they paint a lot of green, and all the squares are wetlands and sea and lakes. And then they use the money 2 times. So they use the money so that when it rains, all the rain will be taken care of and go into the ground, not into the sewer. And then when it's not raining, it's much better area. Now they're also into Osama bin Laden architecture to put up obstacles against terrorism. So we see all these phases. Here are some examples. We have 4 swimming pools in the harbor. The harbor water is now so clean that you can swim. And we have wonderful spaces for skateboarding and whatever. And they have in Copenhagen a strategy. We will be the best city in the world for people. And they have some examples of that. Means it's not about making the city center nice, but making sure that people are treated properly all over the city. And some examples will be this, where in the old days we had asphalt from wall to wall in the streets. Now all the major streets are only 2 lanes, one this way, one the other way. A good median where you can rest, and then you have street trees and bicycle lanes and sidewalks. And the lower street is much more safe, much more beautiful, and can take the same number as the upper street, because the traffic engineers are much better nowadays. Another thing of this new program are what we called continuous sidewalks, continuous bike lanes, so that it's the pedestrians who have the right of way, and if a guy in a Mercedes have to go out on the street, he will have to wait until there are no people around. This is wonderful as a sign, as a policy, but much more beautiful is that my granddaughter, 7 years old, she can now walk to school because all the way from her door to school, she can stay on the sidewalk. She doesn't have to cross any street. That's important when you're 7. They have also done a fantastic amount of work for the bicycles. There are complete bicycle network all over the city with good bicycle lanes. And based on this, there has been really an alternative transportation system where every third family has a cargo bike so they can bike each other around. The trick in the bicycle system is to have safe crossings, and they have found out a number of ways to make them very safe. And now I know that when my grandchildren are 12, they can go all over the city on the bicycle. That means that you're mobile from your 12. To have a good bicycle system, it's important it's integrated with the public transportation, which it has become, and such a big success that all the time they have to make bigger space in the trains for the bicycles. They have a policy that it should always be quicker to take your bike than to take your car. And that has meant that many, many people do bicycling because it's the most convenient, quickest. What this has resulted in is a fantastic increase in bicycling. And the latest figure we have is just before COVID, and that was that 49% used bicycle for going to city. 10 years ago, it was 38%. What we have learned from Copenhagen is that you get what you invite for. If you make more roads and wider streets, you get more and more traffic. But if you make better conditions for walking, for public life, and for bicycling, you get more people walking and more people bicycling and more life in the city. This we've learned. Then you can ask, what happens if you do all these awful things to a city, take away lanes for the cars, take away parking spaces? Yes, you may experience, I could tell also about Sydney and the other places where you did all these awful things, and all the time you end up having awards and having, I've actually become an honorary citizen of Sydney because I took all the car parking away. That's funny. But what happens in Denmark, the Minister of Culture reads some interesting books, and then she makes an architecture policy, put people in the center of architecture. What happens if you do all these things to a city? Yeah, the city of Copenhagen is visited by 400 delegations of mayors and city architects and planners every year to see what to do. What happens when you do all these dramatic things? Yes, by God, your number one associate, closest, one of my old students, she's made city architect, so now I can sleep at night without worrying about the future of the city. What happens if you do all these awful things to your hometown? Yes, by golly, you may find posters of yourself on the bus stops and on the doors to the metro. What happens if you do all these awful things to a city? You may find the city being named the most livable city in the world. And if you look at these various cities which are on these lists, you'll see that most of them have done excellently in the area of looking well after people in the city planning. So, ending up, cities for the future, dreams and worries. I have some advice to you. What not to do, don't do Dubai. Don't do modernism and don't do motorism. Maybe you should rather do Venice, which is completely for pedestrians. They have wonderful neighborhoods. They're very good for children and for elderly people, but they're a little bit slow on the mobility side. So in between Dubai and Venice, maybe I could suggest that you look a little bit to the Copenhagen model, have humanistic city planning as a major thing in your city policy. Put people first. And it's so embedded now in Copenhagen that you don't ask, you don't discuss it anymore. That's the way we do. And that makes it easier to get forward. So putting people first in city planning, that is the simplest and the cheapest you can do. That is better for everyone in the city. And it's for cities in all parts of the world, regardless of economy. And you can start tomorrow, if you haven't started yet. Good luck with Bratislava. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Very inspiring, entertaining, and futuristic. Thank you so much. And now this is the time for the Q&A. This is your chance to participate in this event. The Slido, as you know, hashtag FutureCity. And we shall start with Juraj Benetin. Servus. Bratislava has not been a city of immigration. This is about to change. What are your recommendations for designing and running a city ready for immigration? Thank you. The first question.
Oh, that's a hard one. Yeah. Of course, yeah, we see, of course, these movements of populations when there are these events in the world, and various ways they are trying to integrate the newcomers. And there's this discussion if we shall make special districts for people who speak special languages, or if we should try to mix it as best we can. I think in Denmark we have found that it is much better to try to integrate as best we can, so that the kids are mixed in the school and whatever. Man, I think we'll have to be more clever in doing this in the future. As you know, we are in the middle of a big crisis. I don't know too much about this.
Thank you. Bratislava has not been a city of immigration. Oh, we did that already. Cities in our post-socialistic regions are often dominated by modernistic housing districts. How to approach their transformation and bring life to spaces?
Yeah. They are struggling with this all over the world. In Denmark, we realize, in Sweden they have blown up quite a few of them and taken them down. They even took one area down because it was element buildings. So they sold all the element to Egypt's army for barracks, and then they ended up with 2-story buildings instead of 10-story buildings. But in Denmark, we take some buildings out, and then we build smaller stuff in between so that the scale is brought down, and all these enormous grass lawns and all this leftover space is being actually activated also by more people, because households are smaller and there are fewer people living in the area. So it was valuable to have an increase in the number of people and having the small scale introduced. That's what they do.
Like a variety. Thank you. What was the most recent thing you learned about cities? What's the most recent thing you've learned about cities?
No comments. No comments. I think it's. I wrote this book 50 years ago, Life Between Buildings, and it's come out ever since. It's still printed, and every time they say, "What shall we change now?" and I'll read it and say, "I have no changes," because it's about Homo sapiens, and he bloody well has not changed in 50 years. It's all basics coming from our body and from our senses, and so actually it's about making people aware that we have the same animal to work for as we had 100 years ago, and they have much the same needs to a large extent. There are some extra ones to look after, and we get older and older, whatever. But Homo sapiens. Some people ask me, I have a little village of 200 people, and you talk about New York and Mexico City and Sao Paulo we worked in. And what can we do with a little one? And I say, are there Homo sapiens in that village? Then you can use the same methods, because we are all, they found out with the DNA that from Japan to South America to South Africa to Greenland, we are all Homo sapiens. We all have the same biological history. So many of the same things is valid from one end of the world to the other, also in small cities.
We're all, as you said, crawling happy people. So the next one, the cities have historically been the places where young adults come, but how to keep them here when they have kids? What kind of childhood have the city kids? This is from Sandra Staselova. Staselova.
That's a good question, because in Copenhagen they have worked very hard, because they knew that they came into cities to study, and then they found a mate and started to have kids, and then they moved to the suburbs. And they wanted to change that so that the people stayed. They have made all the yards in the blocks very green, and so the city is very nice, and you have nature and green very close. So when you look out of your back window, it's rainforest, and out of the front window, it's the main street. So people now are staying, and Copenhagen has the youngest average population in Denmark now, because the people bloody well stay in the city. And that is a question, that's a problem now, because all in the rural districts there are mostly old people, and the younger people are in the cities. That's new problems.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your questions. I'm sure we're going to address more questions during the panel discussion, which will start in about 5 to 10 minutes. So, Jan, if you don't mind, we'll take a little short, we call it a technical break, just to prepare the stage for the panel discussion, and then we will continue. So we're looking forward to seeing you here. Same time, same space, 5 to 10 minutes. Yes?
I have a short little livability test. I'll just show you. I was in Vietnam to publish a book. The Danish embassy helped me, and there was this lady from Vietnam, Mrs. Lan. She worked in the embassy. She's been in Copenhagen for some course, and she came up to myself and my wife and said, "Hey, I've been in Copenhagen. You must have a serious baby boom problem." And my wife could not, and myself, we could not understand the problem. And she said, "Yes, I'm sure you have a baby boom problem." And then we realized that what kind of problem we had in Copenhagen was that actually we don't have a baby boom, we have a problem with population, so there will be no Danes in 300 years left. So no baby boom, but what was the case she saw was a city full of kids. And when you think about Vietnam and Hanoi, there are no kids because it's too dangerous and too noisy and too polluted. But then I realized that what you see in Copenhagen, that is a lot of kids. You see them when they're very small. You see signs of them. You see the kindergartens walking on the sidewalks. You see all these baby carriage cargo bikes with kids all the time. You see them also in the winter. You see the children, they have 1, 2, or 3 kids on each bicycle. You see in the kindergarten, they teach them to bicycle. You know that when they are 5, they can go on bicycle all over the city. My daughters tell me that when they are 5, it's all right if there's a grown-up. And when you are 12, you can go by yourself, and you can have a Copenhagen lullaby. So my take on this is, if you see a city with many children on the public spaces and many old people, it is surely a sign of a good city. That is the livability test. Dingo.
Thank you so much. That was a good one. Thank you. So we're looking forward to seeing you in about 5 minutes. Vidíme sa približne o 5-10 minút. Ďakujeme.